When the peace agreement with Egypt was signed, one area of dispute was left intentionally vague. What was to be the fate of the West Bank, otherwise known as Yehuda v'Shomron? Prime Minister Begin and his Likud party were ideologically committed to Israel keeping all of it, while President Sadat could not be seen as having abandoned the Palestinians. So the agreement called for granting the Palestinians autonomy. In practice, that meant very little. To most Israelis, what went on in the territories conquered during the Six-Day War was far from their minds, unless you happened to live there or were doing regular or reserve military service there. The quiet ended in December 1987. The immediate cause was a truck accident. An Israeli truck driver in the Gaza Strip lost control of his truck and it collided with an oncoming Arab car, killing 4 people. Palestinians in Gaza began rioting, confronting Israeli troops who had no riot control training. The troops were being showered by stones and even Molotov cocktails, and they responded by firing live bullets. They wounded 30 of the rioters and killed 1 of them. Thus began what became known as the First Intifada. For the next 2 years, a combination of riots, civil disobedience, and some terror attacks took place throughout the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel was forced to assign thousands of army troops to maintain some semblance of order. Many in Israel became convinced that the status quo was not viable. In 1990, the unity government of Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres fell apart, and Shamir established a narrow right-wing government. Israel during this period faced a new challenge, one that embraced with enthusiasm: the massive immigration of Soviet Jews to Israel. From the moment that Mikhail Gorbachev had become the new leader of the Soviet Union, he began to slowly open the gates of the country to allow its suffering Jewish population to emigrate. Many of those immigrants had come to Israel, while others had gone to the United States. As Gorbachev's government continued to liberalize, the United States concluded that Jews living in the Soviet Union were no longer victims of oppression, and thus were no longer automatically granted refugee status. Therefore, for those Jews wishing to leave the Soviet Union, the one place whose gates were wide open was Israel. In 1990, an unprecedented 181,759 Soviet Jews made Aliyah to Israel, and that was just the beginning. Israel scrambled to build housing, provide jobs, and integrate them into Israeli society. Ariel Sharon became housing minister, and his nickname, the bulldozer, was put to good use as Israel built unprecedented numbers of apartments in a very short period of time. And although mistakes were made, those who moved to Israel during this period soon found housing and jobs, and the Soviet Aliyah transformed Israel. During these years, Israel continued to make progress in the high-tech area, with many new Israeli companies being founded. It launched its first satellite, the Ofek 1. The Israeli aerospace industry, however, suffered a severe setback. Intense U.S. pressure convinced Israel to close its Lavi project. The Lavi was the first fighter jet totally designed in Israel, and the U.S. aerospace companies lobbied the U.S. government to block the production of the Lavi, fearing a new competitor. American culture continued to seep into Israel during this period, when in 1990, MTV arrived in Israel.